Are you, my friend, going through the rituals with God, doing the Christian thing, the church thing, and yet you feel like God is far away? Do you suppose that might be because truth has stumbled in the street? And maybe it's because you have not embraced truth and gotten it beyond your head into your heart. We'll talk about it today. I love it, precious one, that you want to know God's precepts for life, that you want to know what are His standards, what are His teachings, because it's through His precepts that we get understanding. Well, all this week, we're looking at Isaiah chapter 58, 59, and 60, and we're looking at what happens when truth stumbles in the streets. And if you want to look at a society where truth has stumbled in the streets, you look at the statistics about the church in the United States of America, and you will see that we are so like the world in our statistics, in our divorce, in our immorality, in our lack of a biblical worldview, etc., 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 that we can easily see that in the United States of America, truth has stumbled in the streets. You see it in England. I was just there, and you see it in England. Truth has stumbled in the streets. And what about your country? Because I know that this program goes far beyond the borders of the United States of America. Or maybe you're in a country where truth never was. But you look at Greece, truth was in Greece. Of course, they started off with all this idolatry, but truth arrived because God said to Paul, come over to Macedonia through a vision and help us. And truth came, and many came to know truth. And because of that, they were set free. And yet, you know what? You can know the truth, you can walk in the truth, but then if you don't keep growing in the truth, and if you allow the culture to come in and woo you and seduce you, and you don't give time to studying the Word of God, then truth will stumble in the streets. So God is writing to His people. God is writing to His elect nation. God is writing to the nation of Israel, to whom belong the fathers, the covenants, the promises, the law, the commandments, the ordinances, all of this, and yet truth has stumbled in the streets. We see that in Isaiah 59, verse 14, just in case you didn't get yesterday's introductory message to this passage. Now, we're looking at 10 things that happen when truth stumbles in the streets. The second thing that I want you to see, the first thing we saw is when truth stumbles in the streets, God's people are walking in iniquity. They have turned their back on righteousness, and they are living unrighteously. They are transgressing. They are sinning. They are committing iniquity. They are forsaking the ordinances of God. The second thing we see is that when you do this, your religious activities are of no avail. In other words, they aren't going to profit you anything. And this is what you see happening in Isaiah chapter 58, because they're saying to God, look, we're fasting, but you're not hearing. Listen to what he says. He says in verse 2 of Isaiah 58, yet they seek me day by day. They're in their sin, they're in their iniquity, yet they seek me day by day and delight to know my ways. As a nation that has done righteousness and has not forsaken the ordinance of their God, they ask me for just decisions, and they delight in the nearness of God. What he's saying is this, is he's saying you're going through your religious form, you're going through your ritual, and you're delighting in your religiosity and the sense of the nearness of God, and yet you are in sin. They're saying to him in verse 3, why have we fasted and you don't see? I'm fasting and you're not doing anything about it. Why have we humbled ourselves? Because that's what fasting is supposed to be. Why have we humbled ourselves and you do not notice? Behold, he says, on the day of your fast, you find your desire. And not only that, you drive hard all your workers. He says, behold, you fast for contention and strife and to strike with a wicked fist. He says, you do not fast like you do today to make your voice heard on high. He says, hey, you want to be heard? You want to be heard by me? You want me to respond to your fasting? You don't fast the way you're doing it. You're going through the ritual, but your heart is wrong. Your religious activities are to no avail. Listen to verse 5. Is it a fast like this, which I choose, a day for a man to humble himself? Or is it bowing one's head like a reed that just droops over? Or for spreading out sackcloth and ashes as a bed? Will you call this a fast, even an acceptable day to the Lord? Do you think that your fasting is acceptable to me when you come along and you spread out your garment, when you put the ashes on your head, when you bow your head, or when you say, no, no thank you, I'm not eating today, or for the next whatever, and you're drawing attention to yourself? He says, do you think that's what it's all about? When in your heart, get it. In your heart, what you are doing is you are fasting for contention, there's strife, you're striking with a wicked fist. Your heart is not right before me. It's an external performance that you're going through. I just want to ask you a question. When you go to church, and you delight in the nearness of God, is it because the music has gotten you whooped up? Is it because you just want to stand there and sing praises to God, but when it comes time for the sermon or for the message, you want it over, you want it done quick, you want to be out of there? Why? Because you've got your kicks. Because you've got your thrills, because you feel good, you feel spiritual. Oh, precious one, if you prefer the singing of the music to the exposition and the explanation and the digging in of the Word of God, you can know this: truth has stumbled in the street. Truth has stumbled in the street, and your religious activities, even your fasting, and really it seems like of all the disciplines, the hardest discipline, the most difficult discipline is fasting, is going without food. Why? Because our tummies growl, because we get weak or we get a headache and that. And yet these people were fasting, but it was of no avail. Why? Because truth had stumbled in the streets. It was external, but not internal. All right, and we know this from the next point. The next point covers Isaiah 58, verses 6 to 14. When truth stumbles in the streets, there's sin in your life, you are not loving your neighbor as yourself, you are in darkness, and you really don't even take delight in giving God His day, giving God His Sabbath. So what is contrary to that? Well, if you want truth to not stumble in the streets, then you're going to get rid of sin. You're going to love your neighbor as yourself. You're going to look for light and not for darkness, and you're going to delight in the Lord. Let's look at it. Let me read it to you, and I'll walk you through the passage. Isaiah 58, verse 6. He says, "Is this not the fast which I choose?" Now, at this point, you learn the true heart of fasting. You learn that it is not just an external going without food, but it is something that causes you to get your heart right with God. So in this passage, you're going to learn, although he's going to talk about the fact that they are, because truth has stumbled in the streets, they're fasting, but they're not getting anywhere. He's going to also show us what our hearts should be like in true fasting. So let's look at it. Verse 6, "Is this not the fast which I choose? To loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke." What is yoking you? What has harnessed you in something that is not right, that is not holy, that is not pure? What relationship are you in that you are yoked in? You're yoked together, as 2 Corinthians 6 says, with an unbeliever. Or what do you have in common with these people that you're hanging around with? He says, "And to let the oppressed go free." In other words, here you are oppressing someone, putting them down. And if you're really going to fast with the right heart, you're going to let the oppressed go free, and you're going to break every yoke. Is it not to divide your bread with the hungry and to bring the homeless poor into the house? In other words, if you really have a heart for God, and truth hasn't stumbled in the streets, but you're walking in righteousness and truth, then it is going to affect your relationships with other people. It says, "And when you see the naked, to cover him, and to not hide yourself from your own flesh." Here's a daughter, here's a son, here's a mother, here's a father, here's an uncle, an aunt, and you're their hope. What are you going to do for them? Are you just going to push them away? Before you do, we better talk about it, but we'll talk about it in just a minute. Welcome back, beloved. As we look at this third point, what we're looking at is the manifestation in a person's life of their attitudes and their relationships when truth stumbles in the streets. And he's going to show us this by saying, this is the kind of a fast that I choose. And see, they're fasting, but they're not getting answers because they're not doing the kind of fast that God chooses. And the fasting has to do not with just the external doing without food, the external picture of humbling yourselves and putting ashes on you and spreading out sackcloth and sitting there so that everybody knows that you're fasting, but it is what's going on in your heart. And so what he shows us in these verses right here is this is the fast that he chooses. It's a fast that causes you to deal righteously with others. And he says, is it not to divide your bread with the hungry, to bring the homeless poor into the house, when you see the naked to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? In other words, what he's showing us is that if truth has not stumbled in the streets, then you're going to love your neighbor as yourself. Then you're going to manifest that love in tangible forms. But if truth has stumbled in the streets, then you're not going to really care about other people, because it's all about moi. It's all about me. Now, when you look at this, you have to stop and think about Jesus in Matthew, and if you'll go there to Matthew chapter 22. In Matthew chapter 22, they are trying to trap Jesus, and they are trying to, to get him to go against the word of God. And so it says in Matthew chapter 22, in verse 36, one of them, verse 5, let me read it, 35, one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law? I love the way Jesus handles this. And he said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and catch this, with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, on these two commandments, summarizing them, depend the whole law and the prophets. It all boils down to two things: loving God with everything and loving your neighbor as yourself. You do that and you're going to keep the law, you're going to keep the prophets, because you have captured the heart of God. And yet, in Isaiah 58, they're saying, why have we fasted and you haven't noticed? And he's saying, because you're not fasting with a proper heart, a proper mind. And this, under this third point, what I want you to see is when you fast with a proper heart, then your light will rise in darkness. You see, when truth stumbles in the streets, we're walking in darkness. We're groping. We can't find the way we're going because we can't see. So watch what he says in verse 8. He says, then your light, and you want to watch light and darkness, as I said, all the way through these 3 chapters, then your light will break out like the dawn, and your recovery will speedily spring forth, and your righteousness will go before you. The glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You say, you're fasting, and God's not hearing, he's not answering. He says, if you fast with the right, in truth, he says, then you will cry, and he will say, here I am. If you remove the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and speaking wickedness. Now, I want to ask you a question. What are you pointing with your finger? Who are you pointing at? And are you giving them the finger in traffic and you call yourself a Christian? Or are you throwing up your hands and going like this to someone? The whole world is going like that. You are to be absolutely different. And so he says, if you will get rid of this, if you will give yourself to the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted. You see these people that are afflicted, you see them in need, and so you satisfy them. Then your light will rise in the darkness, and your gloom will become like midday. And the Lord will continually guide you and satisfy your desire in scorched places. You can be where everything is burned, but God will satisfy your desire and give strength to your bones, and you will be like a watered garden and like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. He says, those from among you will rebuild the ancient ruins. Your life will have purpose. You will raise up the age-old foundations. You will take them back to what it was like before truth stumbled in the streets. You will be called a repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets in which to dwell. Listen, do you want your life to count? Do you want it to have impact? Do you want to be a restorer? Do you want to be a rebuilder? Then truth cannot stumble in the streets. Then you have to have truth not just as an external I know, but as an internal, it has affected my heart. It has affected my life. Remember, we saw that in Isaiah 51:6. You, God, desire truth in your innermost being. Well, watch what he says in verse 13 and 14. And remember this, that the Sabbath was a sign between Israel and God. It was not only a sign, but it was their day of rest. It was their day when they were not to do any work. They were not to plant any crops. They were not to be doing anything but trusting in God. He says, if because of the Sabbath you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day, and you call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and honor it, desisting from your own ways and seeking your own pleasure and speaking your own word, if you will make God's delight your delight, then you will take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And what he's showing is this: truth has to be internal as well as external. And if you will make God your delight, if you will make his holy day your delight, in other words, if you just want to do what pleases God, even if it does not please you, then he says, you will ride on the heights above the earth, and you will be fed by God. Oh, beloved, this is what it means to walk in truth. This is what keeps truth from stumbling in the streets. And you say, but others are going to laugh at me. What does it matter? As long as God smiles at you, as long as he smiles on you with favor. Oh, Paul said, you cannot be a bondservant of men and a bondservant of the Lord. So no matter how truth has stumbled in the streets, beloved, you need to embrace it in your heart and live in the light of it. Welcome back, beloved. You came back for that precept for life, that truth that we need to put into our hearts and live by. And so what is that precept for life? Well, I think that you and I need to understand that truth is not just something that is external. It's not just something that we mentally embrace, but truth affects our hearts, and truth determines our relationships. Remember in John, when Jesus is in the upper room, after he has washed their feet, he turns to them and he looks at them and he says, what have I just done? I, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet. I have left you an example. In other words, his concern was his disciples. He was about to go to the cross and die for them. He was about to be separated from the Father, and yet here he was serving others. Later on in that upper room discourse, he's going to say, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another even as I have loved you. Not love your neighbor as yourself, but now you have a much higher standard. And that higher standard, beloved, takes us to the truth of the fact that when we walk in truth, we care about others. One of the things that the Lord has taught me, and that is, don't divorce yourself from the people that you're ministering to. Don't go and speak at a big conference and disappear. Be out there, and if I'm running the conference, I'm out there. And I'm in the book lines, and I'm not in the book lines because I love to sign books. I'm in the book lines because I love to talk to the people. I love to know where they are. I love to know what's going on. I love to minister to them. I love to see their faces and pat their hands and weep with those that weep and rejoice with those that rejoice. Truth is all about what God is about. And what God is about is the salvation, the welfare, the well-being of others. And when truth stumbles in the streets, it's all about me. It's all about my desires, my wants, my whatever I'm going to get out of it, instead of what I can give to others. So this is your precept for life. Your precept for life today is you make sure that your heart is the heart of God towards others.
Thank you for watching today. Join us for our next program as Kay shares more Precepts for Life.
Are you, my friend, going through the rituals with God, doing the Christian thing, the church thing, and yet you feel like God is far away? Do you suppose that might be because truth has stumbled in the street?
Join us for our next program as we discover more Precepts for Life.